Bafadens, Redsurans Rezagen akras Ukraina, and thus Sanna followed was the Sun Ukrainuans, Nadawapana, Druns Muse Deal, Distant Thump of Unpacks, thus ends distinct Wavuzablo with Anyutka. Officials in Kiev said parts of the country lost power in freezing weather as Russia launched what Ukraine described as a massive airstrike. And across the border, Poland said it scrambled fighter jets and raised air defenses to a heightened state, a reminder that this war never stays neatly inside one country's lines. Ukrainian authorities and international reporting say the attack unfolded overnight into Tuesday, December 23, hitting multiple regions and pushing the electricity system into emergency measures. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy described it as a large-scale barrage that struck homes and energy infrastructure just days before Christmas. In the first reports, Ukrainian officials said at least 3 civilians were killed, including a child, with damage reported across a wide swath of the country. Russia, for its part, has repeatedly framed its long-range strikes as aimed at military and energy targets, while Ukraine says the pattern shows an effort to break civilian resilience through winter. So what, exactly, was launched, and how big was this wave? Ukraine's Air Force said Russia fired hundreds of drones and several dozen missiles in a single coordinated attack. In figures cited by multiple outlets, Ukraine's Air Force put it at 635 drones and 38 missiles, a scale meant to saturate air defenses and force painful choices about what can be intercepted. Ukraine set it down or electronically suppressed most of what was incoming, including 587 drones and 34 missiles. But the attacks still produced deadly results and widespread disruption. That is the hard truth of this phase of the war. Even a high interception rate can still leave enough getting through to damage critical infrastructure. Where did the strikes land? Ukrainian officials said the barrage hit 13 regions, with particular damage in western areas and along key energy nodes. Reuters quoted Ukraine's Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, saying energy facilities in the West suffered the most. Reports also pointed to impacts in and around Kiev, as well as in regions including Zhytomyr, Khmelnytsky, Rivne, Ternopil, Lyumy, and Odessa. The picture that emerges is consistent with Russia's broader strike campaign: pressure the grid, force emergency outages, and make winter itself a weapon. And then there are the human consequences, the details that land hardest because they are not abstract. Ukrainian emergency services and officials said a 4-year-old child was killed in the Zhytomyr region. Another civilian death was reported in the Kiev region, and another in the Khmelnytsky region, according to President Zelenskyy's public statements carried by international media. Beyond fatalities, there were reports of residential buildings damaged, fires sparked by debris, and communities waking up to cold apartments and dark stairwells. Even when the military narrative focuses on drones and missiles as numbers, the lived reality is loss measured in minutes, in rooms, in families. Now to the power cuts, because that is the heart of why this attack matters right now. Ukraine's energy ministry said emergency outages were introduced in multiple regions as crews assessed damage and tried to stabilize the system. Acting Energy Minister Artem Nekraso said restoration would proceed when the security situation allowed. A reality that highlights the bind repair crews face. You cannot safely fix high-voltage infrastructure while strikes are still possible. This was described as one of the largest attacks on Ukraine's energy system this year, and it comes as demand rises with winter temperatures. One reason the grid remains so vulnerable is that it is not just about generation, but about the web of substations, transformers, and transmission corridors that move electricity to where people live. A single damaged substation can knock out power for a large area, and certain high-end transformers can take months to replace, especially under wartime supply constraints. That is why emergency schedules shift so quickly from planned blackouts to sudden cuts. When the system is stressed, operators make rapid load-shedding decisions to prevent a broader collapse. It can mean some areas lose power to keep the rest of the network from failing. Ukraine's largest private energy company, DTEK, said the attack hit thermal power stations, describing it as another major strike in a sequence of repeated attacks on its facilities. DTEK has said its thermal plants have been struck hundreds of times since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, a statistic that underscores just how sustained the pressure has been. Thermal plants matter because they provide controllable power, the kind that can ramp up when demand spikes or when other sources drop. Damage there reduces flexibility, forcing the grid to lean harder on whatever remains stable, including nuclear generation and imports when possible. And then there is the regional ripple effect, made clear by Poland's response. Poland's armed forces said it deployed Polish and Allied aircraft early Tuesday, scrambling fighter jets and putting ground-based air defense and radar systems on heightened readiness. The language from Warsaw emphasized that these were preventive measures designed to protect Polish airspace, particularly near the border with Western Ukraine. That reaction is not new, but it is still significant. Each large wave of missiles and drones increases the risk of debris or stray munitions crossing into neighboring countries. For NATO Eastern Flank, the first priority is to keep the conflict from spilling over, even accidentally. Why would Poland scramble jets if the strikes were aimed at Ukraine? Because air defense and air policing are about minutes. If missiles or drones fly near Polish airspace, or if there is any ambiguity in tracking, fighters can be launched quickly to identify and respond. It is also a signal to Moscow that NATO territory is monitored and defended. And it is a message to Polish citizens that their military is not waiting for a worst-case scenario. In a war defined by speed and uncertainty, readiness is a form of deterrence. Still, the central question remains, why now and why with this intensity? The timing just before Christmas and amid renewed talk of diplomacy is part of the story. President Zelenskyy framed the strike as a clear statement of Russia's priorities, arguing it shows Moscow is not seriously seeking peace while it continues large-scale attacks on civilians and infrastructure. International reporting has linked the strike to recent U.S.-led diplomatic activity, with U.S. officials and envoys meeting Ukrainian and European representatives and maintaining contacts aimed at a settlement. But the basic gap between Kyiv and Moscow's stated conditions has not closed. And this attack underlines that the battlefield and the negotiating table keep colliding. This also fits into Russia's evolving operational approach. Combine large numbers of relatively inexpensive drones with missiles that are harder to intercept, forcing Ukraine to expend air defense ammunition and maintain constant alertness. Drones can be used as decoys to map air defense positions, to trigger radar emissions, and to overwhelm response capacity. Missiles then follow, aimed at high-value nodes. Even when interceptions are high, the defenders pay a price in resources and fatigue. Over time, the attacker's goal is not just immediate destruction, but cumulative degradation. Ukraine's defenders, for their part, have built one of the most layered air defense networks in modern warfare, integrating Western systems with Soviet-era platforms, mobile fire groups, electronic warfare, and a dense warning network. But no system is perfect, especially when the attacker varies routes, altitudes, and timing. Ukraine's reports that the barrage stretched into daylight hours matters here. Daylight complicates certain tactics, but it also extends the period in which sirens, disruption, and strain persist. It is pressure not only on infrastructure, but on daily life and mental endurance. And daily life is the point. In winter, losing power means more than lights going out. It can mean heating systems stop, water pumps fail, mobile networks degrade, and transit slows. Hospitals shift to generators, which require fuel and maintenance. Small businesses lose inventories. Families huddle in warmer rooms. For older residents and those with medical needs, the risk rises quickly. Ukrainian officials have spent years building resilience measures, from backup power to warming centers, but repeated strikes test every contingency plan. There is also the strategic link between energy and industrial capacity. Power disruptions complicate manufacturing, logistics, and military repair work. They also affect the rail network, a backbone of Ukrainian transport, and they create secondary consequences. More diesel burned in generators, more demand for imported components, more strain on municipal budgets. This is one reason energy infrastructure remains a central target in the broader campaign, even when military fronts shift. Zoom out further, and the energy story connects to Europe. In March 2022, Ukraine's power system was urgently synchronized with the continental European grid through ENTSO-E, a technical step that has helped stabilize supply and allowed for electricity trade and emergency support. That link does not make Ukraine immune from damage, but it adds a critical layer of resilience. It can enable imports when domestic generation is hit, and it ties Ukraine's grid security more closely to European partners. But the capacity of imports is not unlimited, and the physical assets inside Ukraine remain vulnerable to strikes. Some reporting also said the attack forced nuclear plants to reduce output, a reminder that even if reactors are not directly hit, the grid around them matters. Nuclear generation depends on stable transmission. If the grid is unstable, operators reduce output to protect the system. That can shrink available power precisely when demand is highest. It is the kind of cascading effect that makes energy warfare so disruptive. It is not one power plant. It is the system around. Meanwhile, Ukraine has continued its own strikes on Russian energy and logistics assets, a pattern often framed as retaliation and as an effort to constrain Russia's ability to sustain the war. Reuters reported Ukrainian attacks that ignited fires at industrial and fuel facilities inside Russia, including in regions such as Stavropol and Krasnodar, after the latest barrage. Ukraine's logic is straightforward. If Russia targets Ukraine's ability to generate and move energy, Ukraine will target Russia's ability to fuel and supply the war machine. Each side argues these are legitimate targets. Each side says the other is escalating, and civilians on both sides live under the consequences. On the battlefield itself, Moscow has also continued to claim incremental gains, sometimes announcing the capture of villages or positions. In this case, Reuters noted Russia claimed it had taken 2 frontline villages, a claim Ukraine did not confirm. These announcements, whether verified or not, are part of the information environment of the war. The Kanchup moral unflunts diplomatic atmospherics and reinfusse domestic narratives. But these Logistruck Kampan an infrastructure is not only about this front. Off is about Chapang Zabruda Stratuk Paktio as wanted dupons, so what is confounded and what remains uncertain. The broad contours are clear. Multiple reputable outlets cited Ukrainian officials and the Ukrainian Air Force describing an attack involving hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, deaths of at least 3 people, including a child, and widespread emergency power cuts. Poland's military publicly confirmed its scrambled jets and raised readiness as strikes unfolded near its border. The precise list of targets and full damage assessments will take time because repairs and inspections follow security conditions, and some details are withheld for operational reasons. But the pattern is consistent with previous mass raids, a mix of drones and missiles, heavy focus on energy infrastructure, and the goal of widespread disruption. Why does this matter beyond Ukraine today? Because it speaks to escalation risks and endurance. For Ukraine, each wave is a test of air defense stockpiles, repair capacity, and civilian resilience. For Europe, each wave near NATO borders raises the risk of incidents, miscalculation, and political pressure. For global observers, it shows that despite diplomatic talk, the military campaign continues at scale, and winter creates an added layer of leverage. It also influences assistance decisions, from air defense resupply to grid hardening to emergency equipment and transformers. There is also a political clock. International reporting has referenced U.S.-led efforts to explore peace frameworks, with U.S. envoys meeting Ukrainian and European officials. President Trump has publicly pushed for a deal, while Ukraine has emphasized security guarantees and sovereignty. And Russia has repeatedly indicated it wants terms that Kiev and its partners say would undermine Ukraine's independence. In that context, a major pre-holiday strike is not just a military action. It is an argument made through force. It signals that Moscow believes pressure, not compromise, can shape outcomes, while Kotse continued attacks prove Russia is not negotiating in good faith. At the same time, the war has shown that both sides can fight and talk simultaneously, and that talks can proceed in parallel with escalation. That is why language matters. When officials say discussions are productive, that can be true in a diplomatic sense, even while the battlefield reality remains brutal. A process can exist without a breakthrough, and a strike like this one can harden positions rather than soften them. The question for the weeks ahead is whether diplomacy can build momentum faster than the military can destroy trust. For Ukrainians facing the cold and the outages, the next question is more immediate. How quickly can power be restored, and how severe will the next wave be? Repair crews will likely work around the clock when conditions allow, rerouting power, replacing damaged equipment, and stabilizing substations. Emergency schedules will shift as the system recovers, and officials will ask the public to conserve electricity during peak hours. But with repeated strikes, restoration is often provisional. What is repaired today can be targeted tomorrow. For Poland and NATO eastern flank, the watch point is vigilance. Each time aircraft are scrambled, it reflects the reality that the air domain is crowded with risk. Missiles in flight, drones crossing large distances, debris falling, and radar tracking under pressure. NATO will continue to stress that it is defensive, that it is not entering the war, but that its airspace is non-negotiable. That posture aims to prevent spillover and to reassure member states while keeping escalation thresholds clear. And for the wider war, the longer-term question is whether this pattern of energy strikes achieves its strategic aims. Ukraine has shown an ability to adapt, to disperse, to repair, and to build redundancy. Russia has shown an ability to sustain drone and missile production and to adjust tactics. The result is a grinding contest of resilience, resources, and political will. Winter intensifies the contest because electricity becomes heat, and heat becomes safety. In the days ahead, watch for three things: how quickly Ukraine's grid stabilizes after this barrage, whether Russia repeats mass strikes in short succession, and how Ukraine's partners respond in terms of air defense supplies and energy support. Also watch diplomacy, not for dramatic breakthroughs, but for quieter signals, meeting schedules, readouts, and the language each side uses about conditions. In this war, words and weapons move together, and the direction of one often predicts the other.